Well, good afternoon, everybody. Today we receive in our research group Professor David Lyon. It's a big pleasure and honor to have you here with us today. And I just want to start saying that I presented you to the group your works and some of your ideas. I share with the students some of your texts before, so we discussed some issues related to surveillance, especially some contemporary practices of surveillance today. And we also prepared, some students prepared some questions to guide our conversation today. Uh, David told me that it's a possibility to not exactly deliver a presentation, but more a kind of conversation or an interview. And I decided to do something in between. So the students want to put some basic questions as some starting points for our conversation. And then you can, of course, develop as you want these questions. And so we can open the conversation for everybody here to make their comments and other questions. And so we keep the conversation going. That's okay for you like that?
Yep, that's just fine.
Uh, okay. And uh, before call the students, I will just present you. I have some students here that are working with me in the organization of this group this semester. And Mariana, she's doing a master. She's a master student, and she is one of the person that will put the questions at the beginning of our conversation. And the other is, where is Malu? Yes, Maria Luisa, she's undergraduate student, and she also wants to put some questions for you at the beginning of our conversation. Uh, Mariana, can you start, please?
Sure. First, dear professor, it's a pleasure to have you here today with us. And our first questions, it's more like an introduction about your researches. We would like to understand better the balance of the possibles of the current surveillance culture. To introduction my question, Vera, in many ways, just to read, to don't be more confused. In many ways, society seems to need surveillance to manage security, to manage health crises and public services, even to personalize some services and some essential services. But at the same time, the surveillance often comes at the cost of our freedom and autonomy. That's something clear in our studies. And what we would like to know is how we can strike a balance between these collective needs and these individual rights that are being compromised. It's a true balance, even possible in this current servicing culture. Uh, my question is clear.
Yeah, fairly clear. I understand most of it. Thank you for the question. Thank you for your welcome. Um, so um, let me start by saying
Não, e
something
parou no meu lugar, cara.
Oh,
that,
sorry.
okay,
Okay.
uh, something that relates to the words you were using. Um, I'm not sure that we can ever strike a balance as you describe it. I don't think it's so much a matter of finding a balance between two things, but I think that it has to do with um, what is appropriate and what is um, yeah, maybe just appropriate is the word I'm looking for. Um, because balance is such an awkward word, it suggests that if we get the balance right, then the scales will come out at the same position. But I think that it has much more to do with the kind of surveillance that we are talking about and the contexts within which that surveillance is being carried out. Now, I understand that the work that you have been introduced to is well concerns the ways in which algorithms are used for surveillance in many different contexts. And that is a critical development that has been going on for perhaps 20 years now, but it has reached a critical juncture because the use of algorithms is being spread across the whole realm of different kinds of surveillance, so that you find algorithms being used um, in platform companies, obviously, um, including platform companies like Uber, which uses algorithms very extensively for the surveillance of passengers in the cars, surveillance of the cars themselves, and surveillance of the drivers. And so you have complex surveillance in contemporary platforms. You also have surveillance in national security organizations. You find it just in so many areas. And what's happening is that um, people are being have data collected on them by all kinds of means, and those data are collected frequently without the knowledge or often the consent of those who are under surveillance. And it turns surveillance into an increasingly automated kind of activity. And it can be used for monitoring people and groups. It can be used for trying to predict their activities or influencing the decision of people, for example, on social media. Our decisions are frequently being monitored so that we will decide in different ways that suit the corporations that are um, that are keeping watch over us. Now, what happens in those cases? Well, in the case of consumer surveillance, then our life chances are increasingly um, constructed through the results of that surveillance. And so our choices come to be limited and directed as far as the corporations can direct them to particular outcomes. Same if you were being surveilled as a driver for Uber. They are trying to discover the best way of making the most money out of Uber, um, and the rights of the drivers become less and less. Um, Police are also using facial recognition, again, algorithmic form of surveillance. and they will use facial recognition, especially in public safety, at sporting events, or any large scale events. And in that case, the news is very bad because facial recognition technologies are notorious for not being able to really capture the features of each individual person, let alone what might be insinuated about that person because of the context in which they were seen by the camera, and so on. So it's it, all of these are using algorithms, and all of them are directed towards the purposes of those who are running the surveillance. It's their interests and their intentions, and their programs that are significant, not the interests and the ordinary everyday lives of those who are Uber drivers or people going to a rock concert or to a soccer stadium. It's not the interests of those who are being watched that are paramount, that are at the highest level for those organizations. And so I hope you can see what I'm meaning by balance, because it's already very unbalanced in favor of the corporations, the policing organizations, national security agencies, whatever organization we're talking about. We live in a world where those organizations have increasing levels of influence, if not power, over the kinds of decisions we make and the kinds of lives that we lead. So that's why I'm saying it's not really a question of balancing one thing with another. It's a question of interrogating what is actually happening and saying, well, is this appropriate for these people and in this context? And especially when it comes to things like facial recognition cameras, they are very, very poor at actually making accurate identifications. And you may have seen the work of Joy Buolamwini, who was like you, a graduate student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she was a computer scientist. And she was looking at the question of facial recognition from a point of view of what algorithms were used and how reliable they were. And she came to a conclusion several years ago now that from her analysis, while the facial recognition cameras, or the algorithms anyway, could recognize white male figures with relative ease, the cameras have a much harder time with faces that are female and dark in color. So black people, brown people, and so on. And so, what she was showing at that in her analysis was, again, you can't make a balance here. You're looking at something that is likely to be used very negatively against some people in the population. You're not even starting with a level playing field. You're already starting with a very unbalanced situation. Likewise, if we're talking facial recognition cameras, a colleague who I know quite well, two colleagues, did a study of the Metropolitan Police in London, England, when they were testing what they call live facial recognition. That is to say, using facial recognition cameras on a mobile unit, a van, a truck with the cameras on it for trying to watch a crowd, say at a soccer game or at any large scale public event. And they use these, wanted to use these cameras for identifying people in a crowd. And of course, similar things have been sought for use at the Olympic Games, for example. Olympic Games is always a context where large corporations want to test their surveillance equipment, and so you often find it there. Well, anyway, the study in London that the police actually asked these researchers to come and examine led to the conclusion from the two researchers that live facial recognition was only at all reliable in less than 19% of the time. 19%, not 90%, 19% of the time. So you can imagine what that means. A level playing field, a balance? Well, no way, because if the system is so weak that it cannot actually identify reliably, that means that people in the crowd will be misidentified, so wrongly identified, and they will be either under suspicion or even apprehended, taken in by the police because of the apparent way in which they were involved in some incident. So my answer to the balance question is that balance isn't a very good way of approaching the issue in the first place. So did you, let me know, students, did you understand my English? Am I speaking slowly enough to be clear?
Um,
Okay, good.
Really very, very clear. Thank you for the answer. I just want to add that the next um, meeting of our group, we will discuss exactly this topic, this subject of a camera with face and recognition, and we'll discuss it with a guy from a organization here in Brazil named Data Privacy Brazil that discussed specific this use of cameras with face and recognition, especially for security purposes. And
Yep.
yeah, it's a very, for me, it's a complicated use of this technology for this kind of purpose.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with you. It's completely unbalanced. In fact, it's not a question of balance at all. Well, Mariana, do you have any other question for Dave Lyon?
Sure. I asked that Maria Luisa. Malu, do you want to ask first?
Okay.
Yeah, even Isabel. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, David, so much for your answer. Your research has helped us to rethink surveillance not just as a technical process, but as this deep cultural, ethical, and political phenomenon, something that we live with and we participate in every day, such as events like rock concerts and platforms like Uber, as you mentioned. And under the concept of surveillance capitalism that you talk about in one of your texts, In a system where the user data is often collected in this name of personalization, such as the big five do when you mention in your text, what do you think that are the deeper ethical implications for autonomy, consent, and manipulation?
Mhm. Well, again, good question. I, uh, I think that there there are many um, dimensions to how we have to approach that. So you're asking about the implications for individuals. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, I mean, about this ethical side, when these large corporations use the data in the name of personalization, as
Yeah,
you give the example in your text about the watches
yeah,
as they track people's lives
yeah,
in this idea.
yeah. Well, um, we we have very rapidly come to live in a world where so many of our activities are tracked one way and another. So many of our choices are recorded, and uses are made of those kinds of information. And we and especially you, have gotten used to the ways in which these operate. Um, I grew up in an era when there was not even a silicon chip, let alone anything called a digital appliance. And so I've actually watched the phases of these developments occur over time. And they are also developments that accelerate. They go faster and faster. And so that adds to the complexity of the situation. Um, and of course, personalization is something that has become increasingly important along with these developments. Um, you couldn't personalize your advertising at all in an earlier era. It simply wasn't possible to personalize. So it always had to be a general matter of advertising. But now that the majority of people carry smartphones, for example, they are the most obvious conduit. That's where those data are moved around the most. It's through the use of the smartphone. I don't know which of my books you're reading, but I write about that in the one on the culture of surveillance, watching as a way of life. And so that's where I talk about that theme. But yes, it is uh, under the name of personalization. And as I say, it's relatively recent that such personalization has become possible. Um, but there are many issues that are associated with that personalization. The data, as I've already said, are frequently collected without the knowledge or permission of the people whose information is being collected. So that's an issue for a start. But then the ways that those data are analyzed is also uh, a very curious one if we're thinking about this word personalization, because in fact, the so-called personalization occurs when the corporations are using data not just from you, but from your friends. In other words, people that you are associated with online in whatever platform it is that you are using. So it's a bit of a misnomer. It's badly named to simply call it personalization because those data that come to be about you are actually about you and your friends. When Mark Zuckerberg from Meta or Facebook first started using the word friend, it was very significant because he was using friend in a very different way. He was using friend to collect data about those who are associated with the person concerned. So your personalization is achieved by looking at a group of people or the data from many people with whom you are somehow associated. And the algorithm um, will determine how you appear then to the corporation. So the image that the corporation has of you is not just your personalized image, but it's your image concatenated, collected with the information from other people. And that is something that is only made possible by the digital and by the use of the digital use of algorithms. So again, I think we have to go back and say, well, where did this come from? How did it develop? And um, what are the ways in which we can question it or um, try to find a way of changing the situation? And of course, then we're in a very difficult world because um, the opportunities for speaking back to the corporations are very limited indeed. And so we have to find new ways of establishing a different mode of uh, communication between corporations and those whose lives they now so easily and um, consequentially use. And consequentially, in the sense that there are consequences for you and me as our data are collected and used in particular ways. But I do think that it raises questions far beyond something that could be dealt with easily through uh, changing a law or adjusting some algorithm or some other relatively straightforward thing. It would have to be a much more complex system that would be developed uh, or something that uh, if possible could be democratically negotiated to change the situation. But as you well know, the very world that we are discussing, i.e., the world of large corporations dependent on algorithmic surveillance, is a world in which democratic activities are being downplayed. They are being eroded even as the need for them is increasing. So we live at a very difficult time. And that's why it's so important that at in your studies, you have the opportunity to think through these issues and see them for what they really are. And I think that's a wonderful thing that you have that opportunity. But the question is, what will you do as a result of having studied these things? Will you be able to think of fresh ways of bringing in democratic and appropriate forms of activity that are not simply compromised by the world of the digital and the algorithmic? So I hope that helps you a little bit, Maria and friends. But that's the way that I'm approaching it.
Thank you, David. It's
Thank
an
you.
important lesson. The friends from Facebook are not our real friends. You have to make the distinction between friends and real friends. And
Yep.
I totally agree with Professor David Lyon. And in fact, I remember the some arguments from Shoshana Zuboff when she told that we have many euphemistic terms or words we use it to describe new platforms, and one of these words are exactly personalization. In fact,
Mhm.
it's another name for we are in fact talking about massive extraction of data in a non-consensual way. It's a real extraction, a forced extraction, an imposed one. And that's why we receive this personalized
Mhm.
information anyway, because it's just possible because of that.
Yep.
Uh, Mariana or Maria, who
Yeah,
wants to make the
I have
next
a
question?
question.
Okay.
Yeah, linking actually with the last affirmatives. In 2022, you and your BDS team project published a work about COVID and surveillance to Canadian citizens. And in that work, you have so interesting affirmations. And I would like to detail two, one of them. I especially study regulation, AI regulation, in sense of the exposed groups. And in that work, you talked about new digital rights and data justice, a new data justice that are to, especially data justice, it's a meaning that we use to criticize the regulations of AI. But in that paper, we didn't have the opportunity to understand in more details what is called that new digital rights, or what is that sense of the data justice. Would you like to describe us more what you call the new digital rights, or if it's something that we know that we need, but we don't know what kind of digital rights we need? Would you mind to describe us more about it?
Hmm. Well, yeah, thank you. It's a good question. The global pandemic of COVID was certainly a game changer because you had a pandemic spread of a particular virus, which had devastating effects in many countries around the world, especially those that were not in any way prepared for it or could not easily get hold of one of the antidotes for the virus. Um, and so, on a public health level, it was a real challenge, and that led to many changes in the ways in which data were collected in order to try to um, mitigate the worst effects of the pandemic. And it's very interesting that I haven't studied this in other countries. I was looking at it locally in our own country of Canada, and it some very large decisions were made in a context of emergency, and activities were permitted in data gathering and data analysis that had not been permitted before. But the pandemic was used as a reason or an excuse or as a pretext, depending on how you look at it, for changing the ways in which we would analyze data. And in fact, members of the team that I was working with and I began by watching what was happening and raising questions directly and raising questions directly with the government data gathering entity that was in charge of collecting those data, because they very suddenly, because of the emergency circumstances, expanded what they would do without a change in the law permitting those extra data gathering and analysis possibilities. And we also had examples of major data grabs of data that was apparently unrelated to the pandemic. So, for example, the Public Health Agency of Canada bought data from the now what was the organization? Well, they bought data from the largest group running our system for communication in Canada, so that the Public Health Agency bought data from a telecom company, and it was geolocation data that they were looking at in particular to track where people were, and thus they hoped to track the course of the pandemic. But the problem with that is that they had neither the people who were involved, and Canada, as you know, has a relatively small population, and so it was actually the majority of the population, 33 million people, whose records were being used in this way. And so that was a matter of knowing where people were at a particular time in order to trace the path of the virus. Now, of course, similar things were done in China at the same time. But the citizens of China were fully aware that the government already had access to those data and used them in circumstances that the government felt were appropriate. In Canada, it was simply illegal what happened, and yet a major telecom company was willing, without telling the people whose data were being transferred, that their data were being used for government health purposes. So, that was something that directly affected many people without their even knowing it. And that, of course, is common within the surveillance field, that we don't know what is happening to data about ourselves, which could be used for all kinds of purposes, many of which we might not agree with. I mean, no doubt many people thought it was okay to collect those data and to pass on the geolocation data of Canadian citizens because of the urgency of the pandemic. But to do it without asking seems to me to have been very problematic. And of course, many other things happened at the same time. The pandemic was a prompt for all kinds of surveillance to take place that had not taken place previously, and especially within the domestic sphere in the home. where people studying from home, working from home, and so on, suddenly discovered that they were being watched and tracked in ways that they had no knowledge about whatsoever. So students who were studying from home discovered that cameras were being used as well as data being collected of a general kind. And people working from home equally had those kinds of things happening. So it's the pandemic was a very interesting moment for seeing what might happen in an in a declared emergency. And of course, the same could be true of any kind of emergency. Um, it could be, a military attack from somewhere else that suddenly leads to changes being made in how data are collected and who is collecting them about what kinds of dimensions of everyday life are going on. So again, the algorithmic surveillance is tremendously important, tremendously powerful, tremendously useful in some contexts where it is being done legally and according to data protection law and so on. But on a larger scale, we don't have, by and large, adequate attention being paid to data rights, what kinds of rights we might have as human beings in the face of such data collection practices. And I think this is really a very important feature. And I think it is especially important for those of us who find ourselves in the midst of an era of very rapid technological change that is being led increasingly by large corporations, because large corporations generally do not include within their way of operating a commitment to human rights or a commitment to the appropriate use of data that they gather on others. And so I used the word data grab a moment ago, and I'm using it because it is the phrase used by a couple of authors. Unfortunately, unlike you at your age, I keep forgetting things because I'm a bit older than you. And one of the names I can't remember. And it's even more embarrassing today because the person concerned is from Brazil. And so I feel badly that I can't remember his name. But
It's
Nick Kudry,
Ricardo Firmino.
the guy that wrote with Nick Couldry, is that the
Ah,
person?
no, it's
Okay.
Ulisses
And
Mejias.
I can find out. But anyway, Nick Couldry and his originally Brazilian colleague have a book called Data Grab. And what they're doing is going beyond what the sort of things that Shoshana Zuboff wrote about in her book on surveillance capitalism. They're pointing out that the activities of um, the corporations that we're describing now, the ones that are using data so heavily and using particular kinds of surveillance, they say that it is very like uh, colonialism because the corporations are doing the same kinds of things as governments in the 19th and earlier 20th century were doing in setting up their colonies, and of course, even earlier. But what they're doing is assuming that where they go, in other words, where they get their data, is like the colonial situation where colonists assume that there are no indigenous people, and they believe that they have a right to collect things from that context. They will extract the uh, minerals and the other desirable goods from those countries, or they will use the labor of indigenous people as if that labor was somehow something that they could own and take over. And so this particular theory of data colonialism, the data colonialism for these two authors is a situation that is has many parallels with earlier colonization. And of course, I'm speaking to you from a country that was colonized by French and British people, and you equally were colonized by people from Portugal and elsewhere. And so that idea, I think, is very helpful because those who are in a situation of data colonization find that their resources are being taken from them without any permission. And they are being used for purposes that they never agreed to. So it's the analogy with colonialism, I think, is very helpful and very striking. And I think it helps us to go beyond the analysis of Shoshana Zuboff, which is helpful in showing us how and why the corporations, starting with Google, were so keen to obtain those data. And this analysis shows what it's like even more clearly for those whose data are being extracted from them without their knowledge and permission, and so on. So I add that in as a comment, and it's a comment too because, or it's a comment that I think is worth making because it reminds us of earlier histories, which have some features in common with what we experience now. And increasingly, as I've been working in the field of surveillance, algorithmic surveillance, and so on, I think a lot more about earlier historical examples and try to see ways that those earlier activities give us clues about what is happening today. In fact, I'm now devoting my research to thinking about those earlier phases in order to try to understand and work out better ways of analyzing the present. Anyway, I hope that gives you some clues. I'm assuming that you're understanding my responses and that this is the sort of thing you wanted. If you want me to give shorter answers,
No, it's perfect. It's
and
perfect.
I can do that too.
No, thanks a lot. It's perfect. I think it's very clear. I think everybody here can follow easily. And I just want to add that Nick Coldry, we read in this group of this research group, another book from him, The Costs of Connection. He wrote this book also with Ulises Mejias. It's not a
That's
Brazilian.
right.
He's a Mexican.
Mejias, exactly.
It's a Mexican guy.
Sorry, Mejias, that's right.
But Ulisses is a very common name in Brazil also, but he's not Brazilian. Okay, but it's a very interesting this comparison between this new colonialism and the traditional or earlier experience of
Yep.
colonization here in
Yep.
America in general. Well, Malu, do you have another question? And so we can open to everybody after your question, okay?
Yes, I do. It's about these large corporations that you talk about how we have access to such a small amount of our personal data that is collected by them. So, in practical ways, are we able to have any clue about whether these large corporations could take these personal data that we don't know about?
Oh, how they might use them, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Um, well, that's like all your questions, they're good questions, but they're also very big questions. Um, the um, this the companies that are collecting and analyzing our data today are building on um, what happened before, and so um, if you go back to a pre-electronic time, you discover that, for example, um, large stores that you would find in a city, uh, large downtown stores in the earlier 20th century started to collect information about their customers. And they said they were doing this in order to try to um, ensure better service for the customers. And so they would write down by hand in a large book, a ledger, they would write down details of their customers and say it was a clothing store or something like that. So they would collect the information about who was buying what and at what time, and other details about their activities, including whether they paid their bills on time and so on and so forth. So this began before the notion of electronic uh, collection and storage of data became significant. By the 1990s, there were corporations that were trying to um, do this more fully using elementary data, and they obtained what data they could from the increasingly electronic records of customers, consumers, and they then turned that into advertising by mail. And so they would send the people on their lists uh, mail shots that told them about new features of their store, the things they were selling, and so on. And so there's a long story here that goes right back to handwritten records being used for a very crude way of doing advertising than what is now possible. But it has grown from that, and today is, as you know, a huge business globally to track and follow the activities of consumers. And that is one of the purposes. Your question had to do with the purposes for doing it. That is one of them. But at the same time, those data are really valuable. That's what Google discovered in 2004. If you read the Shoshana Zuboff version of that story, then that's what was happening. That people were uh, were discovering that their data was being collected by corporations, and it was being collected for numerous purposes, all of which, of course, the corporations decided they would. Sorry about the phone. Um, the corporations decided that they would make their uh, their records more complete, and the interconnection between the different records increasingly became possible on a using algorithms and so on. But those data were also valuable to others. And that's the other part of the equation, that the same data that is valuable specifically for one corporation that is selling clothing or is selling electronic equipment or selling whatever, what might be important for them, they will siphon off. They'll take those data, but they also know, for the same reasons, that those data can be valuable to other corporations as well. And so the data can be used by other groups. And those data are being circulated all the time. And the companies that are the richest in the world are the ones who have found ways of using data of all kinds and concatenating it, bringing it together for multiple different purposes. So it's not as if you're just dealing with one corporation. The data circulate and the data are used and reused for different purposes. And as you heard me say when we were talking about the pandemic, it was the case that in Canada, during the pandemic, the Public Health Agency of Canada was using data that had been produced through people's smartphones, and they were using that for quite different purposes. Well, likewise, the other corporations can benefit from certain kinds of data. And so it's the market for data that has become so significant in the 21st century. And you saw the people that stood around the fascist president of the United States when he became president. And where were they from? They were all from those mega corporations. And it's from those mega corporations that they had made their billions. And it's through increasingly clever and sometimes unexpected uses and reuses of those data that they have become so wealthy. So yeah, the question is a complicated one. And again, I have to point out to you that this surveillance is frequently not for our benefit at all. It is entirely for the benefit of the corporations or the government departments or, policing groups or whatever it is. It's for the benefit of those who do the surveillance. It's not for the benefit of those who are the surveilled. And I think we need to understand that and underscore that because it is so significant that these surveillance methods are being used in a way that is not really to our benefit. They will try to tell you that it's to your benefit. We collect your data so that we can serve you better, so they say. But I think there is a very big but to raise there about the ways in which the data are used and for whose benefit they are being used. So I hope that helps, Maria.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. That was clarifying. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Now I open for everybody who wants to put a question. You can just raise your hand and I give you. Okay, Anna, you can start.
Thank you, Professor, for your contribution in this afternoon. I have I have three questions, but I would like to start with an affirmation that you made. Well, you said that less than 90% uh, of an algorithm and of an facial recognition algorithm has this low percentage of accuracy that can lead to a misidentification of someone. So I would like to know actually if this misidentification serves a sort of police state, and how you, sir, as a sociologist, but not only, see that the events of 2001 and then Snowden came along, but now appears that society today has a kind of numbness to it when it comes to a notion of user extractification, a user extractification system, right? So that is, where do you see this shallow transparency, as we can put it, to say the least? We as a society can embrace, as you, sir, put it, an indignation once again, because we are sort of numb in this context.
Mm. Well, okay. I think instead of answering your question directly, I will tell you a little bit about the research that I have been doing for the last couple of years. Now, you might find it a little bit strange, so I'm warning you, this is strange business. For the last 3 years, I have been studying medieval surveillance. So medieval European surveillance. And as you probably know, I am not a medieval historian. And so I am learning from reading the work of medieval historians. And I'm finding it very, very interesting. For many years, for several decades, I was studying surveillance in the modern era. And those of you who have had experience with sociology will know that sociology prides itself on being about modern society. And I began to realize rather late in the day that I should really have started earlier than the modern era to understand what it is that I have been studying all this time. But anyway, I'm still alive and I still want to study this. And what I'm finding in my study of medieval surveillance, and I'm going right back to early times, so centuries 5, 6, 7, I'm considering as being very important. And then 8, 9, 10, 11, things begin to change. And then there are some significant changes really significant changes that occur from the 11th century onwards. But what I'm finding, and in fact, you can find some of these things for yourselves if you read the work of Michel Foucault, because he also spent some time thinking about medieval surveillance. And I don't think he had all the answers at all, but he did begin to study them, and I have benefited from thinking after him as well. So in those days, there was no electricity, let alone electronic machines. And surveillance was very much human to human activity. and it occurred in many contexts. So, in religious monasteries, for example, you would have surveillance where people are watched over, and that was one context. The legal systems that were developed in early medieval times also had an eye to surveillance. And so you can find evidence of surveillance practices in the legal system. On a practical level, out in the pastures, you would find people watching their animals. And again, that was animal surveillance. And that was frequently the metaphor used for human surveillance. You know, you're like the shepherd watching the sheep. And so it goes on. I mean, I'm reading a number of different sources of early surveillance. But let me tell you what I think four characteristics of that early surveillance are. Now, when I eventually write more about this, I might have more than four, but anyway, four of them would be these: that surveillance is social. It's carried out by and perceives the lives of people in community. And it is not an individualized activity. Increasingly, in modern times, surveillance has become more and more individualized. Even though, of course, as I was saying earlier, the information that is gleaned may be used from other people to come to conclusions about you, me. So that's one thing. It's a social thing. It's not an individualized thing. And both the surveillance is done socially, and the those who are watched are in a social context, not merely as individuals. And then the surveillance is done in a way that stays with certain kinds of internal rules about how the surveillance should be done. And a critical aspect of all that I'm looking at in early surveillance is that it is being done for the benefit of those who are being watched. It's not for the benefit of those who are doing the watching. And Foucault writes about this when he talks about the shepherd metaphor for surveillance, watching over. He points out that, he calls it care, and the dynamic, he says, is the power of care. So, in other words, the point of the surveillance is to care for those who are under surveillance. And then, in terms of the spirit of the surveillance, it is something that is carried out, again, for the benefit of those who are being surveilled, but is being done in a responsible way, such that those doing the surveillance have to watch over themselves more than they watch over those who they are, are expected to watch. So, for example, if you were the abbess, the woman who was in charge of a nunnery or a convent, then you would first have to be sure that you were reliable and responsible. So there's another feature that is very different from today. In fact, each of these features is so contrasting with today. So it's for the benefit of others. It is something that is done responsibly, accountably. You have to give an account of what you do, and so on. So, I'm working through these different ways in which early medieval surveillance was so different from today. But I hope you can hear what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is that in those early days of European medieval surveillance, the purpose of the surveillance was to benefit those surveilled. It was not for the satisfaction in any sense of those who were doing the surveillance. And as I say, it was also a social matter. The ideal that so many people in medieval Europe were following was the notion of the eye of God. You have come across that notion, I'm sure. The eye of God. And that eye itself is social. It's not an individual eye. I was in Mexico a couple of weeks ago, and my friends there, former students like you, were showing me in a old colonial church building, and they showed me the eye of God that was all over this church building, and it's that triangle shape because it's Trinitarian. It's three persons of the Christian God in one in one entity, and so the very act of surveillance is a social act, and the purpose of it has to do with enhancing social relationships rather than individualizing and splitting between different people. So now you can hear the elements of a very radical critique of surveillance from an historical perspective, suggesting that really the aim of surveillance, if you accept the idea that there was something important about those early forms of surveillance, that it was something for the benefit of those who were surveilled and not for the benefit of those who were the surveillors. And, you've been asking me about data rights and balance between one thing and another, and so on and so forth. But you can hear now where I'm beginning to come from, which is seeing surveillance in a very different way that originates in early medieval Europe, but which I think has important lessons for contemporary surveillance. Can you imagine a world where the point of surveillance was truly the benefit of those who were surveilled rather than the massive wealth gaining of those who were doing the surveilling, or power gaining, if it was political surveillance or certain forms of police surveillance? Certainly there's a lot of power there of a much more potentially negative kind. So I'm now looking at these questions of surveillance with new eyes as I think about an historical period that I'm afraid I had not really considered seriously in my earlier life as a scholar, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity of doing it, and also finding other medieval historians who are just so interested and so helpful in developing these things. Anyway, you didn't expect any of that. You didn't ask me to talk about that. You're getting it free, but you're welcome to it, and you can ignore it if that's not
No, oh, David, it's really
what you hear.
interesting.
Very
I
interesting.
really, yeah, it's really interesting. It's a kind of genealogy of
Yeah,
surveillance in some
yeah.
way. And I think it's interesting also because you wrote a lot of books talking about the post-panopticism, the new practices of surveillance after this panoptic model and now I think you come back and start thinking about some panoptic practices of surveillance and how we can uh, you know uh, look at new practices with a new perspective
Yeah.
and it's really interesting and I don't
And
think
if you,
I also will see a new
yeah,
practice of surveillance
yeah,
that it's for the surveillance and not for the vigilant. I don't.
yeah. But if you think about it, the panoptic is again for Bentham, for Jeremy Bentham, who
Mhm.
invented that prison architecture. That is an example of the secularization of the eye of God, because what Bentham was doing was using, I mean, he even used Bible verses from the Christian scriptures in his description of the panopticon, which he had Bible verses with which he had no sympathy at all. I mean, he was a rationalist and a utilitarian and somebody who wanted to make money out of the panopticon. It was going to be for his benefit, not the
Mhm.
benefit of those who were. Anyway, and so, it's interesting then to trace what happened to the eye of God as it was individualized, secularized, rationalized, and so on. But, I don't know if I'm going to have time to do all that study, but it's a very interesting story to see how the eye of God was really, the understanding of the eye of God has been so radically changed through history, and Bentham plays a crucial role in that. Anyway, we can come back to the 21st century if you like.
No, but it's really interesting. Well, I think we just have time for one more question. Anyone
Okay.
here want to put the last question?
Well, if no one has, I have one.
Okay,
But the
Mariana.
preference is about the other person. Someone has? One, two, three.
Anna, raise her hand.
Okay.
So what exactly is your question?
I'm
Oh, it's
sorry. I'm gonna
Anna.
pose it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, from what you sir just exposed from your research, this kind of ancient notion of surveillance can also be perceived in this 21st century, of course, with its particularities and everything. I would like to know if you heard about the techno-solutionism proposed by Evgeny Morozov, because
Mm,
it appears to me that, well, these old technologies of surveillance have become very present, but of course, with the new liberalism outfit within it. And I would like to know how you, sir, view it in this new liberal world.
mhm,
If I would like just to add something, very quickly. Talking even about neoliberalism and so on, we have here in Brazil some movements, some social movements that are trying uh, to organize the technology in other ways. I mean, seeing the citizen as more as producer than user, and trying to figure out about the colonialism and try to recolonialize, think the technological production in a recolonialization way. And so, just adding to Anna
Yep.
question, how do you think that these kind of movements can help us to think about a new ways, a new movement of surveillance, or new ways of defenders against this bad surveillance?
Yeah.
Even actually, yeah, that's
Great.
it.
Great. Good compliment to the other question. Yeah. So I think that this is really important. Um, So Anna was asking about the what possibilities there are for raising questions, and you're adding to that, Mariana. Um, so okay, just going back to what I was saying, that early surveillance in medieval times was human-centered. Surveillance today is technology-centered. It's increasingly something that is passed over to technologies, the technologies we were talking about earlier, the use of algorithms and so on. Uh, the ways that this is handled now is handed over to algorithmic analysis, and it's the power of the machine that is highly significant. And so surveillance today is very machine centric. If you hear of some new development, it's nearly always some new capacity that is being heralded, that is being advertised, some new capacity. And as we develop with artificial intelligence and so on, this is exactly what we're seeing. It's a machine-centric process and practice. And yes, Mozarov, I think, has some very important things to say about techno-solutionism, which is parallel with what I think of as techno-optimism. And together they make for a belief in the significance of new technology for human progress. Again, a word that is very heavy with the weight of many meanings. And so the machine centeredness comes from that sense of techno optimism. Before I was ever working in the field of surveillance, I was very struck after 1978 when the silicon chip was first brought into play. Eventually, somebody had worked out how to etch an electronic circuit onto a board of silicon, onto a very thin sheet of silicon. Of course, it was done for military purposes. The Americans were worried about the possibility of an attack from the Russians, and they wanted to find something that would be lightweight and suitable for what they thought was going to be a war in space. And so they tried to find something, and that's how they came up with the silicon chip. But for other reasons, people began to see the possibilities of the silicon chip in the 1980s. And then gradually that grew into what we think of now as the digital. And then eventually in the 1990s, the internet. And eventually, after that, the kinds of changes that we've been talking about into the world of platform companies, platform surveillance, and so on. So I think that motif, that way of thinking about technologies in terms of techno optimism and techno solutionism, the two go together, is tremendously important. And it has everything to do with the importance of machine centric thinking. It's human centered. And sorry, it's machine centered. Whereas I'm increasingly, I mean, for a long time, I have believed that we should be working in a much more human-centric way as we develop our technologies and not merely in a machine-centric way. And so, if we can find ways of developing new techniques, including for some of the basic needs that human beings have that involve certain efficiencies, let's say, in using machines, then that seems to me to be perfectly acceptable, as long as the system itself is human-centric. That is to say that it's human purposes that are crucially involved here, rather than the logic of the machine being seen as superior to the logic of human beings. And of course, we hear that in the world of artificial intelligence. I read the work of a Canadian who is a leader in artificial intelligence. His name is Joshua Bengio, and he was a winner of the Turing Prize, that is like the Nobel Prize for computing, back in 2018. But he is a human-centered thinker and analyst and technology expert. His thinking is human-centered, just like some of the earlier developers of computers themselves were actually human-centric in their thinking. In 1993, we mounted a research workshop that was in surveillance studies, and we invited the person who he was an older person by that time, older than I am now, and we invited him to speak. And he was the person who basically brought computing to Canada. And he was the first person to have a mainframe computer in Canada at the University of Toronto. Anyway, we invited him to speak at this event, and it became very quickly clear to me that for all his knowledge of computing, just like Joshua Bengio today, who is working in artificial intelligence, his thinking, his outlook, his way of considering these media, these technologies was human-centered, not machine-centered. And I think it sounds so simple and so basic, but it's so easy for us to think in machine-centric ways because we see it all around us. And therefore, I applaud any efforts by groups of people to, for example, create different kinds of platforms. The platform principle is a really good one for mounting a means of others to share for a particular purpose. And I think it can be a very positive thing. I don't regard it as a negative thing in itself. It's the way that the platforms have been developed in machine-centric ways, and of course in ways that benefit contemporary global capitalism. But it is there are plenty of opportunities for thinking outside the box and doing different kinds of activities with similar machines. And so I'm not opposed to artificial intelligence if it is being used in particular ways that don't make assumptions about it being somehow congruent with human intelligence. I think human intelligence is quite different from machine intelligence. But if we can develop, especially in groups, new ways of doing things that will still use the available technological potential, but it's human-centered and not machine-centered, I think those possibilities are right there. And I think they're worth taking. And, Joy Buolamwini, who I mentioned earlier, what did she do when she discovered those huge anomalies in facial recognition accuracy? What did she do? She founded an organization. As a new PhD graduate, she founded an organization, and the organization is called the Algorithmic Justice League. So, in other words, she saw a possibility of not just a major finding in her PhD work, but also of turning it into a platform for further analysis of the use of algorithms for just purposes. So again, that turns it to being a human-centered rather than a machine-centered approach. Now, unfortunately, I have to talk to another professor in a different part of Canada, and I think I'm already late for her.
Oh,
So if you
I,
excuse me, if
okay,
you
no,
excuse me,
no,
I
I
think
just
I'm going
want
to have to leave.
to thank you
Oh,
very much for taking your
you're
time to
welcome.
be with us here. And you have another a meeting, so thank you, not only
Yep.
for today, but also for 3 years ago, everything in Canada. You welcomed me and my family, and I hope you and your family are fine. You, Shu, team, everybody, and I really miss everything from my experience in Canada 3 years ago.
Well,
And I
it was
hope
good
you
to
the
have you
best.
here. And really good to be with a whole bunch of students. I really enjoy being with students. So thank you for your questions. And I hope you continue to enjoy, benefit from your studies. And I hope that some of you will be able to think in terms of human-centered surveillance, human-centered activities rather than machine-centered. Anyway, many thanks for your hospitality. Nice to be with you. So,
Thank you. See you next time. Bye bye,
okay.
David.